Okay, so welcome everyone. We're very happy to have you today for the last webinar in our pesticide selection and resistance management for your vineyard webinar series. This is, as you know, a webinar series that's put together by UW-Madison Extension and University of Minnesota Extension. And I'm Christelle Guedo. I'm the fruit crop entomologist and extension specialist at UW-Madison, working here in the entomology department and with extension. And we're very happy today to have one of our co-webinar organizers and also a speaker, Klodd, who's an assistant extension professor in fruit and vegetable production at University of Minnesota and Department of Horticultural Science and University of Minnesota Extension. Today, we're going to be talking about, or Annie will be talking to us about selecting herbicides for the vineyard. Before I let Annie introduce herself more, if she decides to, I would like to remind everybody to mute yourself for the webinar and type in your questions in the chat or the Q&A. That's totally fine. We will address the questions at the end of the webinar. We will also have a quick poll at the end, kind of a survey of how the webinar went for you. And this will be our last webinar for this series. So hopefully we'll see you again next year for the webinar series on grape. We still have one more that Annie will be presenting next week. That will be in the Apple webinar series, I believe. So without further ado, Annie, I will stop sharing my screen and let you take it over.
Great. Thanks, Christelle. I'm going to share my screen and get my presentation up. Okay. There's a lot of windows to hide on Zoom before I can actually see my screen. This is auto playing, so hold on just a second. I'm gonna make it stop auto playing here.
Always a lot to manage.
I know. All right, so thank you for the introduction, Christelle. I guess I don't often give any more background information on myself, but I guess I could. So I've been here at University of Minnesota Extension working on all fruit crops, not just grapes, since about 4.5 years ago. I started in January 2018. I grew up on a pretty large vineyard in Iowa. My family started growing grapes in 1996, right at the very beginning of when that started becoming more popular in the Midwest. So I've been around the Midwest cold climate grape world for quite a while, and I really enjoy the challenges that we deal with growing cold climate grapes. I've always found it really interesting, and I admire the people who do it because it is a lot of work. So today we're going to be talking about something that we don't talk about quite as often as maybe we should, which is how to use herbicides in the vineyard and create an overall management plan. And the vineyard that I have in this, this intro slide, as you can see, one row looks pretty weedy, and the one next to it looks not so weedy, and there's not a big difference in visible growth of the canopy. So we're going to be digging into how important is weed management actually for vineyards, and how to go about designing your weed management plan in an effective and responsible way. So specifically, the topics that we're going to cover today: first, how much do weeds matter in vineyards? Maybe I'll be challenging some perceptions, and maybe I'll be giving people an excuse not to care quite as much. We'll see. And then I'll be digging deep into herbicides. We're going to talk about pre-emergent herbicide options, post-emergent herbicide options, herbicide resistance, and then we're spending a lot of time today on deciding what to spray and when to apply it. And so this webinar is mostly going to be really practical today, and I'm hoping that people walk away with it with an idea of, okay, this is what I'm going to spray in my vineyard this year, and I feel confident in knowing how to select it, basically. All right, if we have time at the end, we'll talk about non-chemical weed management tactics, but I don't think we're going to have time to get to that today. We'll be talking more about that next week during the ground cover webinar, and maybe at some point at the end, let's share a link to that. So first, let's start at the very beginning. What is a weed? There's a lot of different definitions out there for what a weed is. One of my favorites is a plant that is out of place and not intentionally sown. So anything can be a weed if it's not growing where you want it to be growing. So even a raspberry plant can be a weed if it's spread out from where it's supposed to be growing. There are two main types of weeds that we like to start with, and that's grasses and broadleaf weeds, also known as forbs. It's really important that we distinguish whether a weed is a grass or a broadleaf, because a lot of herbicides are either specific to grasses or specific to broadleaves. And since we are growing grapes, which is a broadleaf plant, there are a decent number of herbicides effective on broadleaves that can injure grapevines. And so it's very important to know what kinds of plants each herbicide is effective on and what kind of plants you have in your vineyard. So if we look at grasses, there's then two basic types of grasses, which are annual grasses and perennial grasses. Same with broadleaves. We have annual broadleaves and we have perennial broadleaves. So when you're looking out in your vineyard trying to figure out what kind of weeds you have, it's important to, you don't necessarily always have to identify them to species. We like to, but at least if you can identify as this annual or perennial, a grass or a broadleaf, that alone is going to be very helpful in determining what herbicides to apply. Why do weeds matter in a vineyard? There are a few different reasons, and believe it or not, people do ask me this question sometimes. Why do weeds actually matter? The first most basic reason is they compete with our crop, whether we're talking about vines or another fruit or vegetable crop. Weeds compete. Secondly, some types of insect pests and diseases can be harbored on those plants or in that moist canopy that's created by having extra plants in the system. And so they can harbor certain types of pests. Spotted-winged Drosophila is the one that is shown in this photo. And that is a pest that likes to hang out in that cool, moist plant canopy during the day, so it can harbor that pest and keep more of it in the orchard or the vineyard. The third one is aesthetics. And I don't want to just push that one aside, because we work in a business where some of us own wineries, and aesthetics are an important part of the business. And sometimes, having those clean rows underneath the vines can be aesthetically pleasing, especially to people like wedding photographers. When I say that weeds compete with grapevines, they're competing for a few different things. The first is that they're competing below ground for water. Second, they're competing with the grapevines for nutrients, again, in the soil. And third, they're just basically competing for space in the soil. So in order to take up water and to take up nutrients, those roots need to be able to actually have space in the soil. I'm going to turn off my camera for just a minute. I'm having some connection stuff. Okay, hopefully that helps a little bit. So this illustration that I made over here on the right, this is showing basically what can happen when we have weeds growing in the vineyard underneath the grapevines and competing for space. So we know from some research that I did during my master's work at Penn State that when we have plants, specifically grasses, growing underneath the grapevine, those grass weed roots, I'm sorry, can I hold on 1 second? There's something going on over here. I'll be back in just 1 second. I think I just need to move to a different room in my house. Christelle, is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Annie.
All right,
fine.
I'll be just a moment.
Sure.
Okay, so I was just talking about competition and how weeds or any vegetation that's growing underneath the grapevines, it's going to be competing below ground for things that grapevines need in order to produce fruit and in order to maintain their canopy, such as water and nutrients. But then that doesn't necessarily tell us how much does that competition by the weeds matter to the vineyard? Because just because a weed is competing for things below ground, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to compete so much as to threaten the yield and the vegetative vigor that we need to produce grapes. So we don't want to make an assumption that just because weeds or vegetation is there, that it's going to outcompete the vines. So the question we want to think about is, does competition always mean that the vines will suffer? The answer is sometimes, but not always. So we know through different research studies in the Midwest and in Pennsylvania and other places in the US and in Europe that grapes can tolerate some weed pressure. How much weed pressure they can tolerate depends on a lot of factors. So unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to come out to your vineyard and say, I know for sure that this amount of weeds are going to threaten your yield, because it depends on things like vine health. What soil qualities do you have? How much water is available in your soil, and how many nutrients are there? Because basically, if you have enough water and nutrients in your soil, and you have nice deep soil, plenty of space for the roots, there might simply be enough to go around for everyone. So this is a picture of a vineyard in Minnesota where they have had some weeds growing underneath the rows, especially you can see in that row to the left, it looks like there's still a lot of weeds, even though it looks like they've recently done a burn down application here. But you can see that those grapevines, even though they had a lot of weeds, were not suffering. Those are still very vigorous vines that they've still had to hedge back. So because grapevines are just so vigorous, they can sometimes withstand quite a bit of pressure in a wetter environment. There's no research that I know of in the Midwest that shows that 100% weed control is needed for healthy vines. There was some research in the Finger Lakes recently that I found very helpful. It was done by Cornell University, the lab led by Justine Vanden Heuvel. And she did a couple of studies where they put annual cover crops underneath the vine rows. And they wanted to see what is the effect of those cover crops on the, not just the roots, but on the growth and yield of those vines. And in my master's work at Penn State, I was doing very similar work to this as well. So in one study, they found that when they had an annual ryegrass underneath the rows, it reduced the size of the vines in 2 out of 3 years. But the other 2 plants that they planted under those vines did not reduce the size of the grapevines. They did not reduce the ability of those grapevines to grow vigor. So another study they did on that site showed that natural weeds growing under the vines reduced yield and pruning weight, and otherwise cane growth, by 57%. However, something that I found really interesting was that that same study found that primary bud survival was greater in the plots that they treated. The bud survival was greater in the natural weedy plots than it was in the glyphosate treated plots. I didn't dig into why that was. And then reduction in vigor, I wanted to point out, isn't always a bad thing. You know, sometimes we do a lot to reduce the vigor of our vines, such as shoot thinning, leaf pulling, and hedging. So just because vines are reducing, or just because weeds are reducing the vigor of our vines, that doesn't always lead to something bad. There is a time in a vineyard's life when weed control is very, very important. Every single type of crop, not just grapevines, but everything, broccoli, apples, carrots, everything has a critical period for weed control. That's a technical term that we use in weed science. And the critical period of weed control means the time in the crop's development when it is most sensitive to competition by weeds. And so during this time, that means it's the most important time to control those weeds as well. And so this is usually in the youngest stages of the plant, such as the first year when we planted our vines. So here's 2 pictures showing 2 newly planted vineyards, both of which are doing a pretty good job managing the weeds in those vineyards. Okay, so in these 2 pictures, so this is a vineyard located in eastern Minnesota. And what we're seeing here, I know that it doesn't necessarily show this in the photos, but these rows are adjacent. So the rows on the left are immediately adjacent to the rows on the right. And the only difference in these rows is that the rows on the right were allowed to have the weeds grow, and the rows on the left were treated with herbicides. And so the rows on the left, and these are Itasca vines, they were growing very, very vigorously They were allowed to grow freely, and you can see that the ones on the right were significantly stunted. So this is a dramatic example, but it is an example of a time when, if we're not controlling weeds in those early years, it can theoretically really stunt the growth of those vines. When we have new vines, I do really recommend using grow tubes on those young vines in order to facilitate safe herbicide sprays. It allows us to spray herbicides around those vines without hurting that fresh new tissue. For me, you know, that is the main purpose of a grow tube for me, in my opinion. If the grow tubes are on, don't forget to actually do the weed control. So this is an example where you can see that the vineyard manager actually spent quite a bit of time going through that vineyard and putting grow tubes on everything, but then they did not go back and spray effective herbicides. And it just skipped quite a bit on me for some reason. They didn't go through and spray effective herbicides, so they went through all that effort to put up the grow tubes, and they're still not having good weed control. So if you put the tubes on, don't forget to do your weed control. And in mature vineyards, I would say just don't lose sleep over a few weeds. This is a weed, I can't remember what the name of it was, but it's just a really low growing weed that was growing in a vineyard underneath the rows. The person whose vineyard I took this picture at might recognize it because he's on this webinar today. But that weed is not competing so much with the vines because those roots are so shallow. It's not really doing anything. So don't lose sleep over a few weeds. Allowing a few weeds to grow can have a few benefits. The first is reducing herbicide use. The second is saving cost on herbicide application, reducing erosion potentially. So if you've got a really steep hill, maybe letting a few weeds grow in those rows can help control erosion. However, again, if you do that on young vines, it could cause some stunting like we saw in that example before. Weeds can add organic matter. Some weeds like this one are ugly but harmless. And then weeds might limit excess vine vigor. If your vines are just too vigorous, you're having to go through there all the time and hedge, maybe having a few weeds isn't a bad thing. Okay, but as we know, a lot of us do want to have decent weed control in our vineyards, especially in those younger years. So what are we going to do? Let's talk about using herbicides. We're going to talk about when to spray, what to spray. I'll go through post-emergent and pre-emergent herbicides, and I'll talk about the differences between new and established vineyards, and then avoiding herbicide resistance. Before I go there, are there any questions on what I just talked about? I'll pause for a second and see if we can think of 2 questions. No questions. All right, so I'll keep going then. So in this next part, this is going to get really practical, and I'll be mentioning these resources several times during the rest of my talk. These are 2 guides that I really, really recommend every grape grower in the Midwest have in your shed or on your computer that you can refer to. These have a lot of tables comparing the effectiveness of different herbicides on the weeds in our vineyards. It shows which ones are pre-emergent, which are post, and it tells really important information about how to spray these. It has rates and everything. So I really, really recommend everyone get these 2 guides. So first, let's talk about when to start spraying during the season. It's April right now, and you might be thinking about which products to order and which products to use in this coming year. So it's a good time to think about when to actually start spraying those. We generally don't need to be spraying quite yet. It's a little bit early. There are a couple reasons for that. One is most of our weeds have not started thinking about coming up yet. The other reason is if we spray even a pre-emergent herbicide when our temperatures are this low, it's not really going to do much for a while. So many weed species in Minnesota and Wisconsin start emerging in May. And this chart here on the right, this I got from the U of M Extension crop newsletter, and it's showing the dates on the x-axis here, and then percent chance of emergence on the right axis. So this is saying, let's go with the blue line here is giant ragweed. So it's saying that about April 5th, and this is for last year, it's just an example, April 5th, they were expecting a lot of that giant ragweed to start emerging, and then it would kind of plateau and have another flush in the beginning of May. And you can see a couple of other weeds are starting to emerge a little bit later, but we have a lot of really pesky annual weeds emerging throughout like late April and throughout the month of May. So that's when it's really important to start thinking about weed control. Once the weeds grow taller than a pop can, they are a lot harder to kill. This is a principle that I'll be coming back to a couple of times, that pop can rule, because we know it to be true for many weeds and for many herbicides that once they become taller than that, the weeds just have do a better job of surviving the herbicide. I recommend doing your first herbicide application right before bud swell to that 4-inch shoot stage. Somewhere during that time is when you're probably going to be doing your first application. So if you are somebody who's wanting to, you already know that you have a lot of weeds that are going to come up in May, doing that pre-bud swell application of a pre-emergent herbicide can really help prevent some of that emergence that's about to happen. And I'm going to get into pre-emergent herbicides in detail in just a little bit. So what to spray? We have 2 different types of herbicides that we divide them into, pre-emergent and post-emergent. Pre-emergent herbicides are the ones that stop new weeds from coming up. So we're spraying pre-emergent herbicides on bare soil in order to prevent new weed seeds in the soil from germinating in the first place. The second type, which seems to be the one that most people are familiar with, is called post-emergent herbicides. And these are the ones that we spray on existing weeds to kill them. And something that I've noticed is that, especially when we have beginner grape growers, they tend to just want to spray those post-emergent herbicides because they're not as familiar with pre-emergent herbicides. But if you just give a pre-emergent a try and see how it goes, you're probably going to have an easier time with your weed management because you'll be stopping new weeds from coming up. And so you may end up spraying less post-emergent overall. So a common mistake I see, only spraying post-emergents and no pre-emergents. Hopefully this presentation will help with that. So I'll go through some details on post-emergent herbicides first. I'm not going to be going through like a lot of product comparisons today. That's not really the mission of the presentation, but these are a couple of just examples that you see here. So what post-emergent herbicides do is they're designed to kill weeds that are actually currently growing. The activity of those chemicals, though, is very short lasting. So it typically will just kill the weeds that are growing, and then that chemical will no longer be active after that. You can combine a post-emergent herbicide in the tank a lot of the time with a pre-emergent herbicide. So you can be killing existing weeds while preventing new ones. Okay, so choosing post-emergent herbicides, there's a number of things that you want to think about when you're choosing which herbicides to use. The first thing to think about is what types of weeds or what weed species is that product most effective on, and what kinds of weeds do you actually have in your vineyard. The second thing to think about is the level of risk associated with that specific product. All herbicides carry some environmental and drift risk, but some are considered restricted use pesticides, which means that basically they've been designated to have higher risk, and they require a private or commercial pesticide applicator's license to apply them. The next thing to think about is the timing. So some of these herbicides are called a burn down herbicide, which means they quickly kill a broad range of weed species. An example of this is glyphosate, in other words, Roundup or Gramoxone, for instance. And some products act more slowly. An example of this is quinclorac, which we spray for crabgrass in lawns. That one takes up to a couple of weeks to actually look like it's making a difference. So if you read that Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide, you'll find a lot of details on each post-emergent herbicide that is labeled for vineyards. When to apply post-emergent herbicides is really important. Like I said before, at the actual legal labeled rates, they are always going to be most effective on weeds that are less than 6 to 12 inches tall. and weeds become more tolerant as they grow taller. So that's why I mentioned before the pop can rule. If you need to take a pop can out to the vineyard with you, go ahead and do that, but make sure that you're getting out there and getting those weeds before they get taller than a pop can. All right, so the next type I wanted to talk about are pre-emergent herbicides. So these are the type that stop weeds from coming up. So it kills weeds at the time of seed germination. These are typically active in the soil for several weeks. And so that is great because it minimizes the need to spray later. If you've got 4 to 6 weeks where that herbicide is active in the soil, preventing seeds from germinating, that's great. They often need rainfall to activate. So if you spray a pre-emergent herbicide and we have a rain 2 days later, then it's helping to activate that herbicide. But if we don't have rain for say a week, that herbicide is kind of going to sit in the soil until we have a rainfall to activate it. So you might not see that herbicide become effective right away in that case. So these cannot typically kill weeds that are already growing unless it's a pre-emergent herbicide that is in a tank mix with a post-emergent. And it can be combined in the tank with post-emergents. In general, just look at the label and see if there's any mixing restrictions, because not all herbicides are compatible in a tank with others. They don't all play well together, but in general, we can combine pre and post-emergents in a tank and just do one application. So if pre-emergents are not used, we usually see people making frequent post-emergent applications, and it's expensive and less economically sustainable. Let's talk about when to apply pre-emergent herbicides. They are going to be most effective when the ground is mostly bare. So you have few weeds actually living. Like in this picture here, the grower had already done a post-emergent burn down of the grass in the rows in order to plant new vines. And so he is now able to spray a pre-emergent herbicide. The reason why it's important to wait until that ground is bare is because pre-emergent herbicides are going to be a lot more effective if they have good contact with the soil. If you have a lot of other grass or weeds in the way, a lot of that product is just going to end up on the existing weeds and not get to the soil, and it's not going to do much of anything. So I do recommend doing a pre-emergent herbicide generally like once in May at the beginning of the season. And if you do that, it's going to have residual activity for 3 to 6 weeks. And again, it's going to be best to do that application before you see a lot of weeds start coming up. You can do a second spray if needed mid-season once that residual period has started tapering off and once you start seeing new weeds come up. Now there's the question of, well, how do you choose the best product? And I saw somebody enter a question in the chat of what are the best herbicides to use for a vineyard, or maybe you said to use for a beginning vineyard. And it's a great question. It's definitely a question you should be asking. So with pre-emergents, just like I would with post, think about what weed species they actually control. Then think about the level of risk, but also with pre-emergents, we have to think about the age of the vines. There are a lot of pre-emergent herbicides that are only meant for mature vines, and they cannot be sprayed on young vines. That's called an age restriction. And they have the age restriction because it has been found to cause injury on young vines. So if you look at this screenshot that I took at the bottom, this is a screenshot of a page in the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide, where they have a huge, huge table, several pages long, of all the herbicide options for vineyards. And then they say the rate per acre, as well as notes and comments. So this is the row for Dual 2XL. It's saying that it controls annual broadleafs and has some control of grasses. And then it says that there's an age restriction. So it says, do not apply to grapes established less than 3 years ago, unless the vines are on a trellis wire, a minimum of 3 feet above ground. So think about whether or not that situation applies to you. And if it doesn't, or if you're not confident, then maybe choose something else. So if you have a newly planted vineyard, you're limited in options, but you're not limited too much. There are still several options. There's, I'm not going to try to pronounce the chemical words here because I typically embarrass myself, but this first one, people often know it as Surfland, which was discontinued, but there are other products that contain the same active ingredient as Surfland did, so you still have options. Treflan, Prowl, Devronol, and Trellis are other options for newly planted vineyards. Again, just refer to the Midwest Pest Management Guide, they're all in there. So this is a table from the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide. It happens to be page 100 if you have that guide in front of you already. And this is just a very basic table listing some names. This is not a full table by any means, but some names of effective pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides that are labeled for vineyards. So you can see here, like AP means after planting, so it has an age restriction. So Casseron, for instance, you have to wait until 1 year after planting to use that one, whereas Prowl does not have that. Curb has an R next to it, which means that it is a restricted use pesticide, so you have to have a license to apply it. And then, you know, this PHI means pre-harvest interval. So if you're using Rely 280, it's saying that you have to wait 14 days after applying that to harvest. So just make sure that you're looking up all this information and you're familiar with it when you're selecting which herbicides to apply. Once you've kind of gotten an idea of the basic herbicide options, that's when I would look in the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide to get more details on those options that you're considering. You should also look at the product label, and you can also talk to your chemical sales representative for important details about those products as well, because they are also well trained to know information about these products, or if they don't know it, they're trained to know how to get the answers. So this is another screenshot out of the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide with herbicide recommendations for grapes. So we've got what type of weed does it control? What is the name of the material? What's the rate per acre? And then what are some important things that you need to know about that chemical before purchasing or spraying it? All right, let's see what the question in the chat is. I have a nice crop of moss growing under the vines now that no grasses or broadleaves grow there. Does this make any sense to kill the weeds only to end up with moss? I would say that moss is probably not going to do much harm to the vines. And so I think that if weed competition is a concern to you, then it's fine to keep controlling those weeds and then have moss grow. But if there's moss growing, it does make me wonder if there's too much moisture in that vineyard. So that's something that I would look into, but I really don't think that the moss is going to affect the health of the vines as far as competition, because it's really not taking much nutrients at all from that soil. Good question. Okay, so when you're trying to develop your herbicide program or your weed management program for the season, here's some important questions to ask yourself. First, what are you going to spray? Think about what are the age of your vines. So think about if there's going to be an age restriction. What weeds are present? Do you have a lot of grasses? Do you have broadleaves? And do you know what species of weeds you have? What products are effective on the weeds present? What is the cost of those products? And what is the herbicide resistance risk? I want to talk about the cost thing for a second, because prices on pesticides have gone up this year. And there could be a situation in many vineyards where the cost of spraying for weeds is not going to be made up in the yield benefit. So you might think about a scenario where you don't do as much weed control this year because those products are so expensive that it's not going to do good for your bottom line. Just think of the cost and benefit of that. So then when to spray? We like to spray when the wind speed is about between 3 to 15 miles per hour, but for each individual product that can vary. So definitely look at the label. How tall are the weeds? Again, you want to spray before they're about the size of a pop can. Will I be harvesting soon? And if you'll be harvesting soon, make sure you're spraying something that does not have a long pre-harvest interval. Is it a pre-emergent or a post-emergent herbicide? That's the other question. So how old are the vines? Think about, are they new vines or do you have new trunks? If you just renewed new trunks, then you kind of need to treat those as new vines, because that's green tissue that can be negatively impacted by some of those herbicides if they're sprayed directly on them. I recommend using grow tubes, and then definitely pay attention to those age restrictions for young vines. In established vineyards, just keep in mind that weed competition matters less than in a new vineyard. So maybe give yourself some leeway. General guidelines, like I have been alluding to before, but if you're a beginner, this might be helpful. Just think about trying to do one application around May, and definitely include a pre-emergent in that, and then consider adding a post if needed. And then you can consider another application mid-season if it's needed or as needed, if weeds start coming up again. And then some vineyards will also do a application in the fall of a post-emergent if you're seeing a lot of winter annual weeds coming up. So winter annual weeds, by definition, are weeds that come up in the fall, they survive the winter, and then they continue growing in the spring. Horseweed, also known as mare's tail, is an example of this. So if you start seeing a lot of those coming up in the fall, you could consider spraying a fall herbicide to kill them, and it'll make your weed management a lot easier in the spring. You can consider integrating non-chemical methods as well, such as just growing grass or a cover crop underneath the vine rows. All right, thinking about what weeds are present, there are a couple of resources that I know of that can help you identify weeds. The first link is this extension website on our website, weed management / weed identification. And then the second one is Virginia Tech has a really good site for weed identification as well. Maybe somebody can share that in the chat, or else we can try to share those links at the end of the presentation when I don't have the slides open. And then you can think which products are effective on the weeds present. So if you don't have a lot of grass weeds, but you have a ton of broadleaf weeds, like maybe you have a really bad infestation of Palmer amaranth, then you would be thinking about focusing on an herbicide that is really effective on broadleaf weeds. If you have mostly grasses, think about a grass-specific herbicide. But if you have a lot of both types of weeds, then you're going to want something that is effective on both. And so this is a table in Growing Grapes in Minnesota, page 102. It's just a basic table that shows a bunch of common herbicide options. Ignore these two columns for now. I'll get to those in a minute. And then it shows which products are effective on broadleaves and grasses. Okay, herbicide resistance. So if you've been on the previous webinars, you understand the concept of resistance, where basically if we're going to be spraying the same chemical mode of action on a pest over and over and over again, that pest population over time may develop some genetic resistance to what we're spraying. How that works is if we're spraying an herbicide on, let's say, Palmer amaranth, the same herbicide over and over again, there's some natural resistance in that population to that chemical. And so those resistant weeds are going to survive and reproduce, as we see here. And then we're developing a population of more and more of those resistant weeds in the vineyard. And so if you're only spraying that same herbicide over and over again, we can see this issue sort of start to develop. So we like to tell you to rotate those modes of action, because let's say this weed here in this diagram, let's say it's resistant to glyphosate. And now we have a big population in the vineyard of glyphosate resistant thistle, for instance. Maybe spray it with glufosinate, Rely, and maybe it's not resistant to that, so that'll cut out that population. So rotating that mode of action is really important. So here's some guidelines that we like to go by. The first one, if you used an herbicide more than 2 to 3 times last year, use something different next year. Don't rely too heavily on just one. Alternate herbicides for different chemical groups or modes of action. And then 3, glyphosate especially has a lot of common weeds that are becoming resistant to it. And we know we have resistant populations in Minnesota. And so avoid heavily relying on glyphosate, even though glyphosate, we're also familiar with it. It may seem less intimidating to apply. Make sure you have familiarity with some of the other herbicides so you have other options that you're comfortable with. So in this table here, again, this is Growing Grapes in Minnesota, page 100. It shows these different WSSA codes. Those are your modes of action. So each different number is a different herbicide mode of action here. It's how that herbicide targets or kills the weed. And so it's saying Matrix is a pre-emergent herbicide that is a 2 a group 2 mode of action. And you can look at the table for the others. So you can see that Surfland and Prowl, they are actually both group 3. They are the same mode of action. So if you applied Surfland one year and you think, oh, I'll apply Prowl the next year, you're still applying the same mode of action year after year. So just be careful with that. Herbicide drift is something that we should think about in Minnesota. So herbicide drift, unfortunately, many of us are familiar with it. It's the movement of herbicide to off-target plants, such as our crop. Their droplets can blow in the air, or they can vaporize after spraying, and they can travel to non-target areas. So we usually think about other farms drifting onto us, but we can also drift onto ourselves. And unfortunately, I see it quite commonly. So make sure you're following the labels when you're spraying, following those wind speeds, not spraying 2,4-D or dicamba in the vineyard, especially during the growing season when those vines are actively growing. And generally, you will have less risk if the wind speed is under 15 miles per hour. When determining application rates and restrictions, I just say read the label and attend a U of M pesticide safety and environmental education workshop. If you want to spray restricted use pesticides, you have to have your pesticide applicator's license anyway. But even if you don't, I just think these pesticide safety workshops are a good idea for anybody because they teach you how to read a label. You get to practice that. You get to ask all kinds of questions about applying pesticides, and they're very useful. So let's try a really quick, simple example on choosing an herbicide. So in this example, a vineyard has a heavy lamb's quarter infestation, and it also has a lot of annual grass weeds. A couple of facts. The lamb's quarters is a species that emerges in May, and the grower doesn't know what grass species they have, or when it emerges, they just know that it's an annual grass. This is common, like grasses are really hard to identify based on appearance. So that grower needs herbicides that can control both broadleaves and grasses. Since lamb's quarter emerges in May, they're going to make their first application in May before that lamb's quarter starts showing up. So their goal is to find, let's say, for the sake of this simple example, we just want to find one pre-emergent and one post-emergent option that are effective on lamb's quarters and annual grasses. Other goals, we also want to fit in with vine age restrictions. We want the products to be economical, and we want to have a low risk of resistance. So we're going to use the Growing Grapes in Minnesota and the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide to find a couple of products here. So first we go to the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide, and we find this nice table. It's an actual table in the guide, 35, that compares, why does that happen? It's comparing the effectiveness of a number of post-emergent herbicides that are registered for use in vineyards. And so you can see on the left, these are the herbicides and whether they're effective on broadleaves or grasses. So these 4 on the bottom are the ones that happen to be effective on both broadleaves and grasses. And then if we compare the risk of resistance of these 4, we see that Rely 280 is one of the options that has relatively lower resistance. And so maybe you go, okay, I want to learn more about Rely 280 and see if that's something that I want to apply. You go to the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide to the weed management section for grapes. And oh, there's Rely, and we have a lot of information on it. So it says that it impacts both grasses and broadleaves. So good, that's consistent with what the other guide said. And then you see this information about spraying only trunks with calloused, mature, brown bark, unless covered with a grow tube. And then you can find your rates and everything like that there. And then you want to choose your pre-emergent. So let's stick with the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide. You scroll up in that table and it shows a lot of different pre-emergent options. So first you want to see, you want to pick one that has annual grass and broadleaf activity. And then you want to look at this section under notes and see, does it have an age restriction? Because if you're renewing trunks or if you have a new vineyard, you're going to really want to pay attention to that. Here are some of the common mistakes that I see in vineyards. The first is not choosing an herbicide that's effective on the weeds present. So I see it a lot where people might hear from a neighbor that, let's say, gramoxone is really effective. And so they'll go buy gramoxone without paying attention to what weeds gramoxone is effective on. It might be effective for the neighbor because maybe the neighbor has different weeds than you have. So you want to definitely like pay attention and talk to other people about what's effective, but also think about the situation in your own vineyard and what weeds you have. The second mistake I see is not using pre-emergent herbicides and just using posts and having to spray all the time. So I would make use of pre-emergents. And then the third one is letting weeds get too tall before spraying. I totally get it. Spraying is not fun, but it's going to be easier if we get to those weeds before they get large. So do this instead. Incorporate both pre and post-emergent herbicides and apply that pre before the weeds have emerged. Do your research and choose herbicides that target the weeds you actually have in your vineyard. Read the label for important information on each product before spraying it. Use that pop can rule that I talked about with the height of the weeds, and rotate the modes of action that you're using in order to combat resistance. So again, here's the names of those two resources we use today. If you're thinking about taking the pesticide safety workshop and getting your pesticide applicators licensed, just look up the U of M extension PSEE program. And then of course, always look at those product labels to get more information as well.
Thank you, Annie. I'm assuming you're done. Is that correct?
I am. That's it. Yep.
Great. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much for informing us on all of those weed management strategies. And I see another question. I think you've addressed the first two questions in the chat. I see another one from Kevin saying, suckers and burn down herbicides scare me a bit. Can you speak a bit to that timing or process?
Yep. Sorry, I ended up having to give my presentation in my kitchen and there might be some background noise. Sorry if there is. So yeah, Kevin, that is I totally understand that hesitation with products that say that they can be used for sucker control. I hesitate to give really specifics on that today because the product labels should have a lot of information on that, and it just varies so much by product that I just want to tell you to refer to the label on that one. So if you use, I think Rely was one of them that said that it can be used for sucker control. So I would just read the Rely 280 label if that's something that you're thinking about using. And under the Vineyard section on that label, it should have information about using it for sucker control or not using it for sucker control. Because of course, if an herbicide says that it can be used for sucker control, then yeah, you want to think about, okay, if I don't want to kill my suckers, then I probably don't want to spray that, right? So just read the label carefully when it comes to that.
Thank you. There's another question. Does each state have their own pesticide licensing program? And of course they do. And if you get licensed in Minnesota, can you purchase pesticide if you live in another state?
I do not know the answer to that question. Do you happen to know that answer, Christelle?
I believe you would need to be licensed in the state. So if you are, you have to be licensed in the state, I think, where you apply the pesticide. So if you are, so let me read it again. If you get licensed in Minnesota, can you purchase pesticides if you live in another state? I think you can purchase them. It's the legal part of it is where you apply it. So if you buy, so there's a very important point here. It's where you apply. So if you're applying in Wisconsin, say, but you purchase the pesticide in Minnesota, that's fine, as long as those pesticides are actually registered in Wisconsin. So they have to be registered in Wisconsin, and you are licensed to apply in Wisconsin would be my answer to that. But be very careful, because sometimes you can apply, especially online, you can apply everything online. You can purchase, everything online, but that doesn't mean they're registered in your state. And that is your responsibility to figure out if the products you plan to apply are registered in the state where you are. But your license to apply would be in the state you are applying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and just one more clarification thing. Thank you for the answer, Christelle. One more thing I wanted to mention is you don't have to, for most pesticides, you don't have to have the license in order to buy them. It's just if you want to buy one of the restricted use pesticides, RUP, then you would have to get the license to purchase it. So we can still, with herbicides, we can apply most of our herbicide options without getting the license. It's just that if you get the license and go through the training, you're going to be a lot more knowledgeable about the products you're applying.
And we highly recommend to do that if you're applying pesticide, because it's safety information as much as it is how to apply. It has a lot of information in there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Annie. There's another question, but before we get there, and thanks, Robin, for saying that, yes, that answered your question. I'm going to launch the poll. So this is a poll that is asking you 4 questions. It's very short, but just on how helpful the webinar was for you today. So if you could please answer those questions on the poll. At the same time, I will ask Eric's question to Annie. Any insights into any organic products as pre and post-emergent herbicide?
I have looked into this and I have not found any organically certified herbicides that are effective enough for me to recommend them. Unfortunately, there have been a couple of products that were in the past couple of years that were marketed as organic herbicides that actually were found to contain glyphosate. And so they had to be taken off the market. And unfortunately, the farms that had applied them had to basically lose their organic certification because they had accidentally applied glyphosate. So I would just be careful with organic herbicides if you're certified organic. And yeah, I mean, I've read a couple of herbicide trials from California that looked at organic herbicides, and neither of the products that they tested were effective. I don't have that study in front of me right now, so I don't remember the names of those products, but basically I've kind of come to the conclusion that I don't believe that any of the organic options are effective enough for me to recommend.
Eric is following up with a home plate. I suspect that's a product.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with home plate. I'm not sure what the active ingredient is in that, sorry.
Okay. Please continue to answer the poll. We have a couple people that have not answered it. And please continue to put in your questions in the chat. And in the meantime, if you go back up to the top of the chat, I guess I'll put it back again. But this is the link to the website where you can see the recording to the webinar and previous webinars, as well as webinars from other tracks that we're doing, whether it's apple or grape or berries. And I think the webinar next week is also presented by Klodd and might be relevant to both. It's in the apple track, but it might be relevant to grape grower as well. Isn't that correct, Annie?
Yeah, because I'm going to be talking about ground cover management, and part of that is how to grow cover crops like perennial grasses underneath your rows. I would say the comment or the content that I present in that one is just as relevant to vineyards as it is to orchards. So I would love to see everybody there next week. That'd be cool.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you all for answering the poll. And if there are no other questions, if you have a question, please also feel free to unmute yourself right now and just ask your question. That's totally fine. But if there are no other questions, thank you so much all for coming. Thank you, Annie, for a great presentation. And again, this is the last one of our webinar series for the grape track for this year. So we'll see you again next year. I'm sure we'll have again the same kind of series. I think it's very well received and important. So thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Christelle. See you next week.